Hello and welcome to the Cartographer Office Hours. This is a special session dedicated to the discussion around RFC 17, or best known as Convention Service RFC. For folks out there, we have here in the call, besides the maintainers team, we have some VMware colleagues from product management, engineering management, and tech leadership who also support the Cartographer project and its corresponding commercial offering. For this session, we will use the same document as usual, the same agenda. Let me share my screen. I put there a couple of discussion topics that I identified from the last or from some previous conversations. Feel free to add to it. Feel free to modify that. And thank you, Rashid, for volunteering for being the note taking. Okay, thank you. Cool. So I don't know if we had an introduction to RFC 17 from Scott in last session. If someone else from team here feels that we need an additional intro, or we can go straight to the discussion topics. Cool. Thank you. So first topic I identified from previous conversation was the implications of Cartographer becoming a sort of umbrella project. So I don't know if that's the best place to get started, but it's one of the topics I identified previously.
Yeah. I'll just jump in. I think that right now, I think of Cartographer as a project where everybody who is a maintainer of Cartographer, well, actually, let me back off that, because I was going to say any of those maintainers can, would be expected to be able to like alter the code in arbitrary ways. But I think there are some PMs that are maintainers as well. So I wouldn't expect them to be able to alter code. But that aside, that the maintainers of Cartographer are folks who have like a pretty deep knowledge of like, all right, all the bits and pieces, and can reason about those and the implications. And if we become an umbrella project, I would expect that the maintainers at the umbrella level have like decently good grasp of like the pieces in the umbrella, but I don't know that I would expect anyone to be able to alter all the pieces of all of the projects under the umbrella. Similar, I think I would assume that there would be some point when, yeah, so there would be one. Two, if it's an umbrella project, I would assume that there would be some easier conversations about the needs of balancing the needs of the choreographer versus the choreographed. Josh and I were actually just talking about like the values that are exposed by KPAC as an example, and the values that Cartographer would really like to be exposed, what would make our lives easier. And so if there were a path to production where there a default path to production where like every controller that was templated out in that path to production, if every one of those were part of the umbrella Cartographer project, those conversations about the API essentially that's maintained between the choreographer and the default choreographed objects would be there would be clear relationship between those projects, and it would make those conversations presumably a lot easier. And then finally, somewhat related to my first point, a meeting like this, presumably we would want to have some umbrella level meetings, but then also there would probably be some open meetings that were just for the individual pieces, the choreographer and each of the choreographed would probably have worthwhile conversations that they would want to have with their communities that didn't necessarily have implications for the other pieces.
So I have a couple of responses to those, not necessarily answers in any way, but just a couple of things that the one about the choreographed, what projects we pull in. If we pull in projects that mean that we can enforce APIs more easily, I still think there's an open question of whether we want to do that. Like there may still be a requirement that Cartographer is still as malleable as ever. And I believe that's still there, which means that although we can control some APIs, we probably still have to support, you know, enemies as the best way I know to put it. And the in response to what kind of meetings will we hold, I think it's too soon to worry about that. Like we are still an adaptable structure. We can choose what we do. I'd be more concerned about the scope of the work for the existing team in that than I would be worried about how we decide to divide meetings or end up going to too many meetings. And that's my feeling on that, you know.
Yep. One response that I would have to the question of enemies is that it's totally possible. Like Kubernetes resources are, you know, these arbitrary things. So there are some resources that just wouldn't fit with Cartographer. And so hopefully, you know, we hope that Kubernetes best practices will push things in a direction where we can work with all of them. But I could totally imagine situations where Kubernetes best practices don't get us far enough. And what we need are, you know, we just need like one or two best practices that people need to pick up in order to be well choreographed. And in that case, having a suite of tools that one already work and two, so one already works, so you can definitely have a supply chain, and we could say this supply chain works, we can get you to prod, as well as saying to those other resources that don't work, that being able to point out, you know, here is an example of a change that needs to be made, and here's a team that's already made it, and that could be a good conversation point. And I guess the last thing I'd say about that is that otherwise, yes, I totally agree with you. Cartographer should always develop with an eye to supporting the most arbitrary resources possible.
If I can, I'd just like to step back and just say that early on, I think a few of us felt like one of the hardest things about selling Cartographer was that it was dependent on things such as convention service that really made it shine, and examples like supply chains that also made it shine, although they're full of YTT, and we're not sure that that is how we want to promote at this point. If we'd like to make things simpler, more declarative, but nonetheless, we're thinking we'd also love to see TCE go open source and the supply chains be like demonstrably useful supply chains in a one-click environment be the way that we start promoting the product. And I think this is a good step towards that either way. Just, I mean, if this is how we remove the impediment of getting TCE open source with open source supply chains, then I'm all for it.
So I've been out for like a month, and I'm kind of coming back into this conversation a little bit. Just at a high level, can someone help me understand, what direction we're going with this? It seems like there's an idea to make Cartographer an umbrella project, and have convention service be one of the things in that toolkit, right? And then does that mean that we have a different name for what we have with supply chain and delivery right now? I see choreographer, is that the name of that? Or
we hadn't gone as far as naming. There's clearly a bit of an issue if we have an umbrella site, but like the easiest thing we could do is create a site for multiple projects and call that cartographer site, and have cartographer be the core choreographer that sits underneath that. And then the next thing will be convention service as another project before we have to face naming. Facing naming might be worthwhile, but I'm just saying there are ways that we can not do it. We were more concerned about the spirit of this and whether it makes sense to all of us. So help us get on board.
So the discussion right now is talking about, how to deal with the integration of a new component into the project, more at a philosophical level, sort of something like that.
I think it's both. I do think it's both. But yeah, like naming and dealing with the specific implementation stuff should happen. I would hope we talk about that today too, but we wanted to start with the high level. Josh, do you have any thoughts? Because you talked at length about it this morning. I just thought you might have. I don't know that Josh can even hear me.
Oh, what? Sorry.
I was just wondering, Josh, if you had any thoughts about the team's direction on this, right?
No, like all my thoughts this morning were around how this isn't really about like RFC 17, right? It's more of a meta. It's like a meta point, right? Like we identified basically. It's like what are the implications of being an umbrella project, and then like tactical things of like how would we actually achieve this? But because I think it's like there's something that nags at me in the back of my brain, right? When we think about even supply chain and delivery, where like ultimately in certain deployments, like these two things aren't even going to be on the same clusters, right? And so like, maybe even those two things, like, are they really like one component, or are they multiple components? Stuff like that, right? So I think we can extend a lot of the things, and even runnable too. We take that as its own thing. Like, is that part of a supply chain? Is it separate? So there's even like parts of like Cartographer as it is today that we could probably make the same argument for.
Yes, I think it's totally possible to. I mean, those are 3 different reconcilers in the same controller, right? Like, we could definitely see ways that we could just say like, well, let's cleave these off and put them into their own repos. At the same time, those those reconcilers all share code. And so I think there's definitely a big jump between here's so Runnable, obviously the most different from the others. I always think of Runnable as an adapter for resources that can't yet work with Choreographer, that can't yet be choreographed, and as a that adapter is like pretty agnostic as to what's happening on either side. Like, what's the choreographer doing? What's the object, and what are the specifics of this object? It doesn't know. What it does know is it knows stamping out new objects, and that's super similar to what supply chain does. That's super similar to what delivery does. It stamps out new objects, so much so that they do share code. So I think of those as much more similar than convention service.
I think like the way I think about it is like I think my point was like we're already kind of an umbrella project to a certain degree, right? And then the next a lot of the concerns you brought up are actually the next point. It's like, do we want to maintain a single versus a mono repo kind of thing, right? Like we're already a collection of things working in concert to achieve our goals. So like, to me, we're already kind of an umbrella project.
Isn't
I think
the
the tactical questions are probably easier to reason about in like, do we want single versus mono repo and stuff like that? So
I want to plus one to like, let's totally decouple what repos we have and how those repos are organized, right? Like if we had a separate set of templates for supply chain and delivery, those interfaces would not overlap at all, right? They would be totally different CRDs that you could have, if you didn't know they shared the same code, right? You could use independently without any interchange on top of them, just like Runnable is with supply chain right now, right? And so if we kind of say, yeah, sure, they could all live in the same repo, two of them could live in the same repo and another could live somewhere else. We could extract things into libraries if we wanted to later, like take that decision about, the technical debt and how we want to do the organization, put that aside and say, what's the user interface? What do we want? It's somebody who sits down to use Cartographer as a toolkit, right? What buttons do they want to push? What things do they want to install in different places, right? I think if we look at it from that perspective first, and then make the decision about the code later, I agree with Josh that it becomes a lot more obvious to me that we're already kind of going down this path.
So if you see in my comments, I've just put Cartographer with supply chain delivery and Runnable under it, which is what people are saying, right? It's like, that's what we're doing today. Cartographer is this thing that has a supply chain delivery and Runnable under it, right? And Runnable itself is under both delivery and supply chain. It can work in both places to convert edge to level, right? So we'd probably not try to create a dangly tree, I suspect. So if we were to say convention service, we wouldn't say this is a child of supply chain, but that's almost certainly where you would use it, right? And then we just talk about what these things are with some sort of like category theory at the top level. Does that sound about right?
Certainly the current. Go ahead, Stephen.
I was going to say, you can use convention service without supply chain. You can use Runnable without supply chain or delivery, right? They have an interface with each other that is not that materially different even than the interface between supply chain and delivery, which is, there's a third-party thing. In one case, Kubernetes API, in the other case, Git, right? That helps do the interchange, but they are all independent things you could use by themselves, right?
They are, but Zach had an opinion about just how tightly coupled they are, as in the value is. And I think it's important for this discussion today is how much value it brings being nearby.
What I was going to say earlier is that the convention service as it exists today is certainly most useful in the context of a supply chain. I would like to see it evolve to also handle delivery. So as there's custom config for an environment, as something gets delivered, maybe that can be encapsulated into a convention. None of the work to spec that out has been defined, just sort of a notional way that the convention service can evolve. I've also been fairly quiet on these conversations so far, just because the questions about whether Cartographer is an umbrella project or single versus monorepo, I view as largely orthogonal to the RFC. They're fine questions to ask, and I think they're important questions to ask for Cartographer, just that I don't think that the convention service RFC should necessarily be tied to sort of one side or the other of these questions. I think it can work in either dimension, both ways.
Can you talk a little bit more about how, I mean, if we came out of this meeting and said, oh, being an umbrella project would not be right for a cartographer for XYZ reason, what would the implications of that? It sounds like you're saying there aren't any implications of that for RFC 17.
I'm not saying that there aren't implications, but that it's a orthogonal question, as in convention service can be a part of Cartographer, whether it's an umbrella project or not.
What's a more poignant question to be asking about RFC 17 right now? Is
So
it
in terms of the actual
room
content
for
of the
support?
RFC, it's the scope of the capability, whether it's something that the Cartographer project believes that is useful and important to actually exist within the Cartographer project.
I mean, a number of folks on this call will have heard me say, including at this meeting last week, I believe, that I think of KPAC as like super important for Cartographer. I don't know of anyone who's written a supply chain yet who hasn't used KPAC in their supply chain, and it's another project, right? It's not part of Cartographer. I've stated that I think it would make sense if we do become an umbrella project. I'd like to play Red Rover and try to pull it in. The source controller for Flux, very similar. Like every supply chain that we write does that, and so that's where for me, that's the orthogonal question. Is like, yes, I see value in these projects, and that doesn't change my thoughts on their, like, my feeling that they are valuable projects doesn't mean that I think that they necessarily have to be part of Cartographer. I think they in fact present great models of open source tools that have some value on their own, have incredible value when choreographed. That convention service, they present a fine model for convention service. Could do the same. It could be an open source project out in the wild that almost every supply chain relies upon.
I think I see a difference between KPAC and convention service in that, KPAC is presenting this very opinionated way of building a container image, right? It doesn't support Docker files. It's using this kind of technology that's suitable for more, image builds at scale, or when you have developers that, have certain needs around how you build images, right? Right now, I suspect we'd see a lot more people using Tecton to do that image build step. I'm not sure if we've added support for the part of Runnable that returns the status back yet, so you could do that, right? Or if we have good examples that cover that. But if KPAC were part of the project, right, I think, that we're taking a very strong opinion about how to build images in this case. But with convention service, it kind of, for me at least, falls into that area of, like, this is a more generic tool for understanding artifacts and, doing generic Kubernetes things on top of them. There's no alternative to convention service besides not using convention service, right? Just like there's no alternative to supply chain besides, doing some of this orchestration yourself, right? And so in some ways, to me, that's why I feel like, okay, I kind of see that vision of convention service living as more part of the project, where for KPAC, I think they're looking at other things that are more tied to the Cloud Native Build Packs project and the direction they're going.
I believe you're not alone in that opinion either. Could you throw weight on that, Zach?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things like, obviously there's a lot of things that are choreographed that bring value to choreographer. I mean, that's kind of why choreographer is built, right? Just to be able to take these things that are valuable independently and sort of chain them together into something that's greater than the whole, right? And so I think that makes sense. I think when you look at something like KPAC and you say kind of we haven't built supply chains for it, I think that's just because it's been VMware building it and we have KPAC close to home. From a user perspective, like the first things we're prioritizing, like commercial, I know it's open source, but from commercial people who are talking about wanting to use supply chains, the first thing they want to do is bring their own Docker file and bring their own images, right? So it's not so much that, where with convention service, like the thing about convention service is its sole focus is to add value to supply chains. It's not seeking to be an independent project. Scott even kind of was saying, like, it works with supply chains. I want to evolve it to deliverables. These are all like super cartographer focused. And then when you look at like Cartographer itself, like, yes, it needs other things to make it valuable. But I think the sense of what convention service does is sort of like a very specific plugin point, like different than building, which is this sort of generalized thing. It's literally sort of aware that there are steps that are coming through a supply chain that have implications on the status of a thing you want to run, right? Like that's the entire premise of convention service, is sort of being aware of the concept of supply chain. So in that sense, it's really like a custom built extension point that Cartographer just didn't have yet. So I sort of see it as something that's like not like, I can see where we could stretch it as useful independently, as much the same way you can sort of say supply chain and delivery could be useful independently. But in essence, these things, they're so tightly coupled in the like complete picture, the value that you're actually trying to bring, that they're just not different projects at all, is sort of the way I think about it. So like we wouldn't put a lot of effort into convention service right now, building up its own open source community and its own tool chain and something to be plugged into CI/CD. It's something that's really like, maybe it could evolve to that in the distant future if we see people taking these Cartographer pieces and breaking them down. But right now it's pretty much how do we plug stuff into the supply chain flow. So their value is so tightly coupled, it doesn't really make sense to like treat them separately.
Is there something to be said for specific conventions living outside of the project, right? If you have a convention for analyzing build pack images, right? Maybe that's the thing that's too specific or that's too, too tailored, where convention service itself is, without those conventions, is kind of like a different kind of stamper, if that makes sense. Or, it's really responsible for the choreography and orchestration kind of part instead of the
specific conventions were always envisioned as being a separate unit that gets delivered, depending on what capabilities you want to exist within your cluster. So certainly there is that degree of flexibility and extensibility within the convention service itself.
So the RFC doesn't really specify which conventions would come along. At the moment, it would be all that we have.
I would lean more towards none, unless those conventions themselves wanted to go open source. So like we do have a couple sample conventions, one of which is really just like the equivalent of hello world, and the other is a little bit more real and meaty. I would imagine that we would include those as part of the contribution, just so there's something to play around with. But how far the community wants to go with actually offering conventions, how much VMware wants to open source of the conventions that they already have, those are all good questions to ask.
Well, I'm assuming that there's going to be conventions shipped with the community edition. That's where my assumption's at. So I guess that they would be responsible for ensuring that conventions that get installed came with that project.
Yeah, it would be part of the distro at that point.
Okay.
same, like with TAP today, it includes a handful of conventions, and it's TAP's responsibility and not cartographers to decide what goes in. Same way that TAP decides what supply chain to use and what components exist within that supply chain.
Should we put that in the RFC specifically? What side of conventions will move forward with it? Because I think that does also help clarify that, you know, what we're pulling in and why in my mind too.
Yeah, I left that as an unresolved question, mostly just because I'm not able to commit to any of those. And even then, I would have definitely imagined that individual conventions would exist. Like in that case, it almost would have to be treated as an umbrella project to have those fold under the cartographer umbrella. Because those can end up being like very specific to a use case, and they'll have a different release cadence.
So in case like external users or like anyone wants to sort of build new conventions, they would potentially live in their own GitHub repositories, or if there are any conventions we want to like samples we may have in our project, but not actual, nothing beyond those, similar to how we are thinking about, I guess, the supply chains for cartographer.
When you deploy sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that really changes my general feeling about needing to split the repositories ASAP, right? The convention service is a tool that really empowers the supply chains. Then there's probably not a problem with them being released at the same cadence. The idea that there were conventions involved in that, which is sort of how I had read it, was definitely a different reason to change, a different cadence. So I'm really glad you brought that up, Scott. I think basically the rule of thumb here is that we could easily not move on making it a umbrella project if the cadence stays in lockstep. And the thing that would make me say it won't is if we were also trying to support something more concrete than example conventions. No one's fighting me on that.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think it makes more sense. Yeah, I'm not arguing that. I think that makes sense.
Scott, you're one of like the major contributors to convention service. Are you planning on like, what's your plan on helping maintain this thing and stuff? Are you going to still be involved? Or do you want to still be involved?
So yes, my goal is not to just toss this over a wall and then say good luck. So definitely, like I am extremely interested in getting this contribution in, and then, you know, once it gets into the bigger community, kind of trying to figure out how it evolves from there. I don't see this as my full-time effort moving forward, but definitely look to stay involved and engaged.
Is that like, so like strategy type thing? More like product strategy, or?
Yeah,
like
it's always
long-term?
difficult to commit to the future. Things change quickly enough. But I mean, it was created, geez, I mean, depends on when you want to say it was created, like up to 2 years ago. It's kind of the first kind of inklings of what is now it. Like I've been involved for those 2 years with varying degrees of effort, depending on what their needs are. Like I don't see that going away.
So here's to another 2 good years, right?
Yeah, after that, who
Rash.
knows?
Rash?
In response to this discussion about resourcing, there is if we look at it and we decide really it's fine for us to maintain, to Emily's point, I don't think there's much that we need to worry about with the whole umbrella project thing. But I think the team feels, and I want to get a feel for this, but I'll say what I feel. I feel that if there is room for a team to be dedicated to that work on the on the convention service, it would be nicer for us all if we do work out how to get an umbrella solution going, just so that it's easier to maintain, to do maintainer work, like looking for PRs and stuff that's actually related. And this is not because, you know, this is a quick touch on like the monorepo versus separate repos. The problem with monorepos isn't Git. I think the problem with monorepos is tools, right? In general, we're using GitHub. GitHub has a release page. It has actions, and then you'd have to start writing actions that filter on particular commits and PRs so that people can have slightly different cadences, behaviors, expectations, that sort of thing. And we just, and don't know that we want to go to that, but I think that if we find that there's quite a lot of work involved in that, and it wouldn't be about moving across the sub projects of Cartographer, it would be more about there being specific teams for specific work. We might want to talk about the umbrella project in regards to that. So maybe the first trigger is to look at the work involved in consuming convention service.
I'm not sure I understand, like, it seems like there's an idea of what a team is and an idea of how an umbrella project supports a team under that, or, you know, like there's some assumption there about how maybe internal organization and external organization have to flow together in a certain way. And I wonder if we can kind of put those assumptions aside, right, and say there's a project, doesn't, like, you know, I don't really know what an umbrella project means exactly, but there's a project, it has a toolkit, it has some things in it. Some folks from VMware are going to work on that project on different parts. We're going to make sure we have enough people to work on all the parts, and hopefully we have a bunch of people, you know, in the community who work on that project too. Like, I'm failing to understand the underlying problem there, if that makes sense. That
I'm not
comes
talking
from
about a
wanting to pull in
problem.
those terms.
We were thinking being a little bit more early prepared than just, I mean, some of us have encountered those problems working on projects that have to pull in multiple other contributions. And I think the main question is about the maintainer team, right? The team that is defined as maintaining PRs on a GitHub object, a GitHub repository, right? And handling those and being able to read the work that they've got to do for the day and work that's submitted that is contextually meaningful to them, that kind of thing, right?
I mean, maintainers and the ability to merge PRs come from being on the project for an amount of time, understanding the project enough that, you know, you have that responsibility, you know, and maybe some internally, like somebody saying, yes, this is a thing you should do, enough that you have time to do it, right?
No,
but
again,
I don't see a maintainer team as like a group of people that, you know, a company says, yes, these are the people who merge PRs and these are the people who don't merge PRs, right? It's based on.
That's not what I meant. Again, I meant that, well, I guess that is what I mean, because I assumed that there would be a team that would be responsible for merging and handling PRs for convention service if there was a decision that we needed to spin up a focus team on that project. That's our question. Is it enough work that you would need a focus team that included some maintainers, people who are responsible for ensuring that the PRs are merged for convention service, have the context and keep the context? And just talking about a fire hose, are we turning on a fire hose? Is that too hard for all of us to tackle? And that's where we'd make that decision. So I was asking, is the first thing we look at is the size of the fire hose?
Maybe a way to, like, the first part of that question is, once the project joins, are we going to have somebody who's willing to merge PRs and take responsibility for the repo as it enters this open source project? And is that maybe a question, I don't know, for Scott?
But one of
You
those,
know what the plans are.
one of the definitions is that it's not another repo. Like at the moment, if we just absorb it into the existing repo, that's where this umbrella concept or discussion comes from. If it's a separate repo, I think a lot of us find it easier to decide whether something is important to us right now and what it relates to.
Rash, correct me if I'm wrong, but like part of your point is like, let's just make sure we're using the GitHub tools properly, right? It's like,
Yeah,
are we just mashing two things with two backlogs, two separate workflows, two different release cycles? Are we just mashing them together into one repo for the sake of it? And
Yeah.
let's just make that decision. Like, let's just
Yeah,
make
and
sure.
how is it going to affect us who are working on it daily, right? And make sure that it's least impactful. So I think the first thing is to know the size of that fire hose.
Was there a plan to merge all of it together into one repo? Is that something somebody said they wanted?
There's an open question at the bottom of the RFC. Should the conventions be a sub-project, separate repo of Cartographer, or exist in the same repository?
And like at the very top, we kind of outlined like, should this be an umbrella project, and like, should this be monorepo versus multi-repo? And to me, like, umbrella projects kind of like the marketing term that comes associated with being multiple repos. So it's like product decision versus technical decision. But I think they are important.
A lot of projects that ship one binary at the end are 50 repos just because that's how they want to organize their code, right? Like, I think, shouldn't the decision about the organization of the code be around what makes sense, what's easiest for people to deal with day to day and architecturally and all of that?
I think that's what I was trying to say.
I would argue, yes, but going that direction is actually easier, right? 50 different repos shipping together is actually easier to some respects than like fighting the tooling and going the opposite direction. I know this is like, these are things that we can work out. I think it's an important point to raise.
I think that's what we want. One of the things we wanted to discuss is to have a shared understanding that this team feels like it's probably nicer if this thing exists in its own repository. Even if we are to maintain it for now, it would probably be nicer unless there's a really good reason to treat it as a singular thing. Or maybe it's something we should defer, pull it into one repo, see how we deal, how we cope. And whether we find ourselves treating it as a separate assigned workload, or I don't know how to describe it, but like a separately managed or maintained project. There's meetings literally to hash this out. So
yeah, I'm still not clear what does anybody oppose keeping it as a separate repo? It's very, very direct question.
Yeah, so I think it can work in either model. I think there are some benefits to things being as tightly integrated as the rest of Cartographer is. So like if all of Cartographer is in a single repo and then the convention service is off on its own, I think that's a little bit awkward. But if Cartographer is moving in a direction where pipelines is a separate repo and delivery is a separate repo, and then maybe then it makes more sense to me. So that's kind of why I see it as an orthogonal concern, that it's worth having that discussion. I just don't see it as necessarily gating or even necessarily being influenced by this particular RFC. But obviously there's enough conversation here where the team feels otherwise.
I feel like maybe we need to have the same faith that you have a concrete feeling for, which is we haven't really played with convention service. And again, I'm speaking for myself, but you all tell me if we haven't played with it. We don't see how it's an integral part of our daily work in delivering Cartographer's value. When we do, we may have quite different opinions about how it should best be structured. All right. I think the important thing is that we introduce it smoothly, in a way that we can work with. And I wouldn't mind it being part of the same repo at this point, to be completely honest, if we're not maintaining conventions with it. We're not maintaining release conventions with it. And then we can discover that. I'm just saying that, and I'm one for splitting repos personally, but that would be enough that we could just keep moving forward and then find out. And if it's just no one else has any opinions but us with the technical concerns, then we can, you know, the engineering team can then say, okay, it's time to split this out. This is too hard, because it's left up to us, and we know that we have the power to make those choices.
I haven't done the work to actually try hosting convention service from the Cartographer repo yet, but the general dependencies are compatible, so I wouldn't be super worried about it from that perspective. It's more so, how do we want to maintain it? How do we want to release it?
How do we make decisions about how we want to do those two things? Investigate the backlog.
I mean, that always goes back to project governance. Like, I wouldn't imagine having separate RFCs or separate team meetings or anything like that. But if you have a separate repo, then you kind of inherently have a separate issue backlog, a separate set of PRs, and then those would have to be dealt with. I guess it's possible to turn that off, but it'd be awkward.
So do we want to
Machine
have, I was just gonna say, like, should we have someone go off and spike and try to pull convention service into Cartographer? Like, I think at least this entire meeting to me is like, we have no problems like accepting RFC 17, but then it's like, then what, right? And like, that's why we're asking all these very specific questions on how it's going to work, because we just want to know what the next steps are. And like the time frame for all of that.
Time frame, like, I can start doing the work as soon as the RFC is approved enough that it's worth starting that work. So I don't know whether that means the draft gets accepted or whether the final gets accepted, or necessarily what needs to happen between draft and final for the RFC. To the other half of your question, I'm not sure I can necessarily answer it.
Can you share a backlog too?
It's pretty minor. We have a few ideas about adding additional types of conventions. Sorry, additional ways of invoking conventions. So like today, conventions are implemented as a webhook call. So if to write a new convention, you basically have to expose a server that can receive webhook calls. There's some desire to support types of conventions that wouldn't require a separate process. So whether that's writing a convention in something like WASM and then just hosting that inside the controller, or doing something where we basically call YTT and then let that handle the actual work, the actual business logic of the convention. Like those are kind of like the biggest ideas, as well as like what would delivery conventions look like. So it really kind of depends on how do we want to move the project forward. So there's not a large backlog of, there's not a large backlog of work that like has to get done or to like reach minimum viable product. Like it's already kind of at that stage.
Scott, what have you had folks that have been onboarded to convention service? Like how long does it take someone to go from like, hey, there's this thing called convention service to the point where they're, they're ready to be a maintainer?
So there's a few of us who have been involved in maintaining the project. One person was in fairly early, so was pretty involved in getting the code base set up. So that's probably not a good example of someone getting onboarded. There's another case where there's a more recent hire who came on board and has been able to deliver PRs, but also wasn't their full-time effort. So it's tough to say that like they're have had like to give like a wall clock unit of measurement, but the overall the scope of convention service is fairly tight. Like it's a fairly like there's two CRDs. The relationship between them is pretty well defined. So it's not like a complex sprawling domain. Like a cartographer itself is like significantly more complicated.
I was going to just throw in one more spanner with the outstanding work, which is merging documentation and trying to get the documentation to fit with examples and everything else that we're already far behind on, but trying to get ahead on. Is there much to document? Is it being documented?
So there is documentation in the repo. There's also some docs that are related to TAP itself, sort of as the commercial distribution. Getting that into shape would be part of the initial contribution in terms of getting it up to the par of Cartographer and into the Cartographer website and sort of whatever is involved there. Some of it will certainly be a matter of rewriting content, or at least reshaping content to fit. So I wouldn't imagine that's like the least copy paste aspect of the proposal, probably.
I guess that's what I was most worried about, right?
Yeah. But I mean, there's no website today that would have to be migrated over. It's just a matter of like what content do we want to put forward for it.
Do we need to also change the way we document everything else we do now that we're saying that, you know, here's convention service? We've never mentioned it before. There's a big gap in the config templates as it stands today. It's like, what are these for? If you know what I mean, all right? They don't make as much sense as they might when convention service lands. So there'll be some rewrites as well. Just wanted to be, be transparent about the work involved.
Docs are also the kind of thing that's never done.
It's only
done once the project is dead. So like, am I happy with our current level of docs on the convention service? No. I think things can always be better. But like, there are docs we can work on getting them moving forward and sort of getting it integrated and then iterate.
So someone mentioned timelines earlier. I still feel like that's the last thing we need to talk about here. We've got timelines internally as a company, because most people here are VMware. I'm just wondering if there's any hopes for when these things land so that we're aware of that. When convention service is consumable as an artifact of Cartographer?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any product decision that would necessarily negate pushing really fast or going slow. So I think it depends on what's best for Cartographer.
There's one implication with convention service as it relates to Cartographer is around Tanzu Community Edition bringing a lot of the core capabilities of the VMware TAP product to market, and Tanzu Community Edition brings all of the open source only capabilities of VMware TAP product. So, and as part of that story, TCE is planning to bring like the ability for users to create workloads with supply chains going from source code to running apps. There's also planning to support developers being able to make inner loop, like be able to do inner loop development. And that relies on one of the developer conventions. That's like an actual implementation of the convention controller. So that's the one implication. Tanzu Community Edition plans to bring those capabilities to the product, to TCE by the KubeCon May. So that's probably the one product implication.
And yeah, so I'm thinking that our takeaway here is that we're looking for Scott to create a branch that imbibes the convention service and support him where we can, and make decisions about, it would seem to me like we'll make decisions about whether we want to split things with different cadences if we discover them at a later date, the monorepo, multi-repo debate and those sorts of things. Would we agree? Does anyone want to revisit this?
I didn't hear anything that made me think that they should be in the same repo. I heard reasons why we can hope that it won't damage us, but I would still prefer to for it to be a separate repo. Just put that out there.
So we're going to monitor 2 PR sets at this point. We're looking for PRs in 2 places, issues in 2 places. Because those are the 2 things that I heard that were like, yeah, actually, if we could just start with it in the mono repo, we can make a decision as to whether this is too hard.
I think it's a lot easier to go from 2 repos to 1 repo than from 2 repos to 1 repo to 2 repos.
Are we going to have people joining who have context in convention service already and be able to merge PRs? Like, is it maybe better to start with the people who merge PRs on convention service, or people who are joining with context, and then over time we add more people who can merge PRs in that repo who understand the repo better, instead of just, you know, saying everybody can merge PRs or something like that. Maybe that'll get a little more clear once we have an idea of who's going to be working on it. It seems like some of that's still uncertain.
A lot of that often just happens naturally. Like, people who understand sections of the code base are more likely to approve something, or more likely to create a PR. So I don't think it necessarily needs to have separate repos for that to fold true. I'm happy to go either direction. Like, I guess it's probably less work for me to contribute it as a separate repo because it already exists as a separate repo. I'm perfectly willing to do the work to try to get it into a monorepo so we can see what that looks like. And then later on, if the cartographer monorepo splits into multiple repos, then like you can make that decision then.
I think the one thing that you mentioned there, that it talks about culture. Our culture is, if we see a PR, we believe that we should try and get it landed. We don't, as you say, you know, land the things that we feel comfortable with. We spread our knowledge and make sure we understand what's going on by making sure we land the ones we see. So it's just a cultural thing. I'm not sure that will be any different if it was a single repo or many. We'd probably look at both lots. I don't know. I think that's kind of core to what we were trying to get to the bottom of, is this something that we, the maintainers group, is responsible for now? And it feels like we will be, even if we've got help along the way. We are responsible for it. So that's why I personally was like, oh, okay, maybe 1 repo, so I'm not looking for PRs in 2 places, and backlogs and project boards in 2 places as well, was why I
Personally, I feel like a great way to learn about the project would be to be the ones to do the work to move it into our one repo if we decide that's the right answer,
It's true.
rather than someone saying, here's a branch where I integrated a bunch of things in a bunch of different places. And then you go try to learn about it. And then you might come to the decision that this doesn't feel like the right answer. And then what, we just undo it all and just dump that branch, or we try and split again? It seems
Here-
less risky to leave it separate.
I hear an assumption in this that everybody who's working on the project now and everybody who joins the project in order to support this is going to work across all of the code in the project all the time. And I want to challenge that assumption as, is that really the right way to do it? Is that another discussion that we should have?
Isn't that a natural assumption with one repo though? Like, I've never worked on a team where I was expected to only work on one subset of a repo.
I think it's often a reason to have multiple repos as different people specializing in different
Right.
parts of the code, for
Right.
sure.
Yeah. That's why my argument for multiple repos is if there's going to be separate maintainers. At the moment, it feels like we're going to be responsible for the lot
Well,
until
GitHub,
such time as it splits.
GitHub, they're both in VMware Tanzu. GitHub has new repo org level projects that you can cut across repos. Maybe that can help us
Maybe.
manage the two sets of issues and PRs.
Do
if
we want
that's the main
to?
concern?
Do we want to vote or something to try and solve this? Because it doesn't seem like there's quorum. There's also a lot of I'm okay either way. To me, actually, I think the vote might be. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, you go,
I
Scott.
say my inclination is that as long as Cartographer is a single repo project, we should make the contribution into that repo. Like when the Cartographer decides it's time to split apart into multiple repos, then we can make the decision about what happens to conventions at that point, assuming it gets merged.
There was a pending issue raised to split already, and not even on any of the products, but on the docs as being a product. We the issue is raised that that the docs change at a different rate, and it's confusing to assume that a tag represents docs and it doesn't. And so we wanted to create a doc site for, also because then waiting for. Currently, we have no selections to get rid of validations for code tests, code validations, while we're making updates to the docs. And it's quite frustrating when we've got a merge that we want to throw in, which has a much lower PR boundary as well. It's like, yes, let's get that doc merged in and then let's move on. They move at different rates. So we've already got one of those outstanding that I thought we were going to discuss during this meeting, but we never got the time. So I was going to suggest that maybe the right first step is that it is a separate repo, so that Scott, you just move it. All right, so it's in the open. We're in the open sooner. We start consuming and putting into the docs, which is still in our mono repo, but there is a plan to separate those out, or at least a discussion to be had about separating those out. And that is at least the simplest thing that can be done to keep us moving. That's my suggestion, because we don't seem to have quorum.
I think what I correct me if I'm wrong, but what I hear from Scott is that your preference is for us to treat convention service as, just another one on the list of supply chain runnable delivery. And it feels like everyone else, all the other maintainers are not yet as sold on that. And so it's hard for us to kind of jump on board with the idea that like, until runnable is separate, convention service can't be separate. And I think it's hard for us to commit to like bringing it in at this stage. And I think letting us kind of get our feet wet in it as like a separate repo will help us maybe get to where you're at. But it feels like we're kind of talking.
Yeah, or it might prompt us to split runnable out ASAP, right? And go, yay, finally that thing's out of there.
Just feels like we're not in sync right now about our expectations about how this project looks, or exactly how it fits in relation to the three existing components. And it doesn't feel like we're moving towards a shared understanding at the moment.
Seems like maybe Josh should be part of that decision in the end. So maybe we defer for now.
Okay. We might make a decision in the blind and just inform you all once we've spoken to Josh.
Maybe Cartographer Arch could do it in the public channel if you want to bring it up
Yeah.
asynchronously.
It's a VMware specific channel. Gotta edit the recording again.
No, in open source. In the open source discussion. Once we've made a decision, we'll pop it there. Yep. Thank you, everyone.